Dr. Jennifer Mason had spent 14 years working in the Atlanta History Center's archives, and she'd learned that history has a way of hiding in plain sight. On a humid afternoon in March 2019, she opened a cardboard box marked Wilson Photography Studio, Miscellaneous 1900-1910, and found a photograph that would consume the next 8 months of her life. The image showed 23 African Americans standing in front of a weathered wooden house, cotton fields stretching endlessly behind them. Most group portraits from this era captured people staring dutifully at the camera, but something about this one felt different. Several faces were turned slightly to the left, as if watching something approaching just beyond the frame. The children weren't smiling. Neither were the adults. There was tension in their postures, in the way some of them held their hands, in the tightness around their eyes. Jennifer turned the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, someone had written, "Glenwood, August 1906, for Chicago family." The handwriting was careful, deliberate, as if the writer had known this image needed to be preserved. She photographed it with her phone and began the process every archival historian knows by heart, searching for context, for names, for the story behind the faces. Her first searches turned up nothing. No Glenwood in Fulton County records. No community by that name in any Georgia census data from 1900 or 1910. It was as if the place had never existed. She spent the next week cross-referencing property records, land deeds, and historical maps. Finally, in a dusty volume of 1880s county records, she found a single reference. Glenwood Settlement, Negro Farming Community, SDU 1883, approximately 200 acres. The notation was brief, clinical, and it raised more questions than it answered. If 40 families had lived there, where had they all gone? Why did the 1910 census show no trace of them? Jennifer began the painstaking work of identification. She started with facial recognition software designed for historical photographs, then moved to traditional genealogical research. She scanned death certificates, birth records, marriage licenses. By late April, she'd identified 14 of the 23 people in the photograph. What she discovered made her hands shake as she typed notes into her laptop. Elias Carter, the tall man standing at the left edge of the frame, had a death certificate dated September 29, 1906, cause listed as complications from injuries sustained. Hannah Carter, the woman in the center holding 2 children, was admitted to Georgia State Sanitarium on October 15, 1906, and died there in 1914. Thomas Wright, the teenager in the back row, had no records after September 1906. Sarah Johnson, the elderly woman seated in front, had a death certificate for September 28, 1906. The pattern was undeniable. 19 of the 23 people had either died or completely disappeared from all official records between late September and early October 1906. Only 4 names persisted into 1910 census data, scattered across different states: Michigan, Illinois, Ohio, California. The date kept repeating, September 1906. Jennifer knew that date. Every historian of Atlanta knew that date. The Atlanta Race Massacre had begun on September 22, 1906, and most accounts focused on the violence in downtown Atlanta, the mobs on Decatur Street, the attacks on streetcars. But as she dug deeper into contemporary newspapers from late September and early October, Jennifer found something that made her breath catch. A tiny notice in the Atlanta Constitution on September 30th. Rural disturbances reported. Order restored in outlying settlements. She found another reference in the Fulton County Sheriff's log. Sept. 28. Responded to reports of unrest in Negro Farming District. Situation resolved. Property abandoned. No names, no details, no official death toll. By June, Jennifer had assembled a file 3 inches thick. The photograph from August 1906 showed a community at the height of its prosperity. 23 people gathered to commemorate something, to send proof of their existence to family members in Chicago who had migrated north. 6 weeks later, 19 of them were dead. The final piece came from an unexpected source. In late July, Jennifer received an email from James Wilson III, the great-grandson of the photographer who'd taken the original image. His grandfather had kept meticulous records of every photograph taken at the Wilson studio, including client names and dates. The entry for August 17, 1906 read, Glenwood Community Portrait, paid in advance by Elias Carter. Special request, make it look like we're proud. We are. Beneath that, in different ink, someone had added a note years later. Only negative I ever hid. Couldn't destroy it. Couldn't show it. Now you know why. Jennifer stood in the archives photography lab, holding the original photograph under magnification. She could see the details now that she'd missed before. The way Hannah Carter's hand gripped the shoulder of the girl in front of her, protective and fierce. The rifle barely visible leaning against the doorframe behind Elias. The clothes they wore, Sunday best, clean and pressed despite being work-worn. These weren't people posing for a casual snapshot. These were people documenting their survival, their success, their refusal to disappear. And then, 6 weeks later, someone had tried to erase them completely. The official death toll from the Atlanta race massacre remained disputed, ranging from 25 to 100. But no historical account mentioned Glenwood. No memorial marked where those houses had stood. No textbook included these names. In August 2019, Jennifer published her preliminary findings in the Journal of Southern History. The article was titled, The Glenwood Community, an Unmapped Massacre. Within days, she received emails from 3 elderly women, all descendants of the 4 survivors who'd fled to northern states. One message contained a single sentence that brought tears to Jennifer's eyes. Thank you for proving my great-grandmother wasn't crazy. She told us Glenwood was real, but no one believed her. The photograph that Jennifer had found in that dusty box wasn't just a group portrait. It was evidence of a crime that had been hidden for 113 years. It was proof that 23 people had existed, had built something, had stood together in the August heat and asked a photographer to document their pride. And it was proof that 6 weeks later, 19 of them had been murdered for that pride, their deaths unrecorded, their community erased, their story buried so deep that even their descendants had begun to doubt it was real. Elias Carter woke before dawn on August 17, 1906, the way he had every morning for the past 23 years. The heat had already settled into the wooden frame of the house he'd built with his own hands, making the air thick and syrupy even at 5 in the morning. Through the window, he could see the first hints of pink touching the eastern sky above the cotton fields that stretched for 200 acres in every direction. Those fields represented everything: freedom, ownership, proof that a man born into slavery could build something that would outlast him. He lay still for a moment, listening to his wife Hannah's steady breathing beside him, and allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. Today, they would take the photograph. The idea had come from Hannah's sister Josephine, who'd moved to Chicago 3 years earlier and wrote letters that painted pictures of a different world: factories instead of fields, paved streets instead of red Georgia clay, Negro children attending schools with real books and real teachers. Send us a photograph, Josephine had written in her last letter. We tell people about Glenwood, but nobody believes us. They think we're making up stories about colored folks owning their own land. Show us. Prove it's real. At first, Elias had dismissed the idea. Photographs cost money, and money was something you saved for seed and tools and emergencies. But Hannah had insisted, and when Hannah Carter insisted on something, she usually got it. Besides, she was right. They had something worth documenting. Glenwood hadn't always existed. When Elias was born in 1872, this land had been part of the Whitmore plantation, and his mother had picked cotton in these same fields while wearing chains around her ankles. He'd been 7 years old when she'd told him the stories about before, about overseers with whips and auction blocks in Savannah. Remember, she'd said, gripping his small shoulders with calloused hands. You're free now, but free don't mean safe. Free don't mean they'll let you stay that way. She'd died when he was 12, and Elias had spent the next 10 years working sharecropper plots for white landowners who paid him barely enough to survive. But in 1883, something remarkable had happened. A Negro businessman from Augusta named Solomon Webb had bought 600 acres of abandoned farmland at a government auction, and he'd offered to sell parcels to freedmen at prices they could actually afford. 25 families had pooled their savings and purchased plots. They'd called it Glenwood, after the grove of sweet gum trees that bordered the creek running through the property. Elias had been 17 when he'd paid his first installment on 40 acres, $20. He'd saved for 3 years to get that money. The white clerk at the courthouse had looked at him like he was crazy when he'd come to register the deed. "You know you're buying swampland, boy," the man had said, not bothering to hide his amusement. "That soil won't grow nothing but mosquitoes." But the clerk had been wrong. The soil was rich bottomland, and Elias had cleared it tree by tree, boulder by boulder. He'd built a one-room cabin that first year, married Hannah the second, and by the 5th year they'd expanded the house to 4 rooms with a real wood floor and glass windows. Their 3 children had been born in that house. Thomas, now 14, Mary, 11, little James, who'd just turned 7. They had a milk cow, 18 chickens, a mule named Samson, and 42 acres of cotton that would yield enough this harvest to pay off the last of the land debt. By 1906, Glenwood had grown to 43 families. They'd built a church from heart pine lumber, established a school where Mrs. Sarah Johnson taught reading and arithmetic to 26 children, and created a lending circle that helped families buy equipment and seed. On Saturday nights, they gathered at the community hall for music and dancing. On Sunday mornings, they filled every pew at Glenwood Baptist and sang hymns that made the rafters shake. White people from nearby towns looked at them with confusion and sometimes anger. The fact that Negroes could own land, could prosper, could build something that looked almost like a town, it challenged assumptions that white Georgia preferred to keep unchallenged. There had been incidents, fences cut, a barn fire in 1902 that everyone knew wasn't accidental, anonymous threats nailed to fence posts. But Glenwood had survived. Elias had become something like an unofficial mayor, the man people came to when disputes needed settling or decisions needed making. He'd never wanted that responsibility, but it had found him anyway. Maybe it was because he'd been one of the first. Maybe it was because he had a gift for talking to white merchants in town, without either groveling or giving offense, a delicate balance that kept the trade flowing while maintaining dignity. Or maybe it was simply because he was tall and broad-shouldered and had a voice that carried authority when he needed it to. Whatever the reason, when the community needed someone to negotiate with the cotton buyer, or represent them at the county courthouse, or deal with the sheriff when problems arose, they came to Elias. The photograph had been his idea to turn into something larger. If they were paying for a photographer to come all the way from Atlanta, why not make it a community portrait? Let Josephine in Chicago see all of them together. Let the photograph show what 43 families could build when they had land and freedom and determination. So he'd passed the word at church 2 Sundays ago, and people had agreed to contribute 25 cents per family to split the cost. John Wilson, the colored photographer who ran a small studio in Atlanta, had agreed to make the trip for $12, a significant discount because, as he'd written in his reply, "What you're doing in Glenwood matters. These photographs will matter too." The morning moved quickly. By 8 o'clock, Elias had fed the mule and chickens, checked the cotton for boll weevils, and helped Hannah prepare breakfast for the children. By 9, he'd washed at the pump behind the house and changed into his Sunday suit, a dark wool jacket that was too hot for August, but looked proper for a photograph. Hannah had pressed her best dress, the blue calico with the white collar she'd made herself from fabric she'd traded eggs for at the general store in town. The children wore clean clothes with their hair oiled and combed flat. Little James kept tugging at his collar and complaining that it scratched, but one sharp look from Hannah silenced him. By 10 o'clock, families began gathering at the clearing in front of the Carter's house, where the light was good and the background showed the houses and cotton fields stretching behind them. 23 people came, representatives from 15 families. Not everyone could make it. Samuel Brooks was 68 and too ill to leave his bed. The Washington family had a new baby who wouldn't sit still for a photograph. Others were in the fields working, unable to spare the time. But 23 was enough. 23 was a statement. They arranged themselves carefully, with the elderly women sitting on chairs borrowed from the church, the children in front, the men and younger women standing in back. Elias stood at the left edge, and Hannah held Mary's shoulder in the center, with Thomas beside her and James sitting cross-legged in front. John Wilson arrived at 11, driving a wagon loaded with equipment. He was a thin man in his 40s with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that moved with practiced efficiency as he unloaded his camera and tripod. He'd made the 60-mile journey from Atlanta over 2 days, and dust covered his clothes and equipment. But his eyes were sharp and focused as he surveyed the group. "This is good," he said, more to himself than to them. "This is very good. But I want you to look proud. Don't just stand there like you're waiting for permission. You own this land. You built these houses. Look like you know that." He positioned them again, adjusting heights and angles. Then he paused and looked at Elias. "Mr. Carter, you asked me to make it look like you're proud. But I want you to actually be proud. All of you. When I take this photograph, I want every person who sees it to know that you're not asking for anything. You're claiming what's yours." The sun climbed higher. Sweat trickled down backs and foreheads. The children fidgeted. Wilson disappeared under the black cloth attached to his camera and made final adjustments. "Hold still now," he called out. "This exposure will take several seconds. Don't move, don't blink, and don't forget what I said. Be proud." The shutter clicked open. Elias stood absolutely still, feeling the weight of the moment. 23 people frozen in time. 23 lives documented. Proof that they existed, that they mattered, that they'd built something real. The seconds stretched out. Someone's breath caught. A chicken scratched in the dirt behind them. Then Wilson emerged from under the cloth and said, "Got it. Beautiful. This one's going to last." They broke formation slowly, muscles relaxing, conversation starting up again. Wilson carefully packed his camera and plates. Elias paid him from the community fund, 12 crisp dollar bills that represented sacrifice from 15 families. Wilson shook his hand firmly. "I'll develop this in Atlanta and send you prints by the end of the month," he promised. "Maybe I'll keep one for myself, too. Frame it in my studio. Show people what's possible." He loaded his wagon and departed, leaving wheel ruts in the red dirt. The families dispersed back to their homes and fields. The children ran off to play by the creek. Hannah went inside to start preparing the midday meal. Elias stood alone in the clearing, looking at the spot where they'd all gathered. The sun was directly overhead now, burning down from a cloudless sky. The cotton in the fields behind him would need picking soon. Another few weeks and they'd begin the harvest, the crucial weeks that would determine whether this year brought profit or merely survival. But for now, for this moment, everything felt balanced, stable, secure. He didn't notice the man watching from the tree line across the field, didn't see the way the stranger studied the houses, counting them, measuring them, memorizing details. Didn't know that in Atlanta, newspapers were beginning to print stories about Negro uprisings and racial tensions, or that white men in bars and meeting halls were working themselves into a righteous anger over imagined threats. Elias Carter stood in his yard in the August heat, thinking about the photograph and what it would mean to Josephine in Chicago, and he allowed himself to believe that the worst dangers were behind them. 42 days later, he would be dead. But on August 17, 1906, under a perfect summer sky, Elias Carter was proud and safe and alive, and surrounded by 22 other people who believed the same thing. And that made the photograph a lie, not about who they were, but about what was coming. On September 25th, a white stranger rode into Glenwood asking about criminal elements hiding among the colored farmers. Elias told him politely that there were no criminals here, only families trying to work their land. The man smiled, tipped his hat, and rode away. That night, Elias lay awake listening to the sounds of crickets and wind through the pines, and felt, for the first time in 23 years, genuinely afraid. Hannah Carter knew something was wrong the moment she saw Jacob Miller running toward their house at 6:30 on the evening of September 28th. Jacob was 71 years old and hadn't run anywhere in at least a decade, but he was running now, his thin legs pumping beneath him with desperate urgency, one hand holding his hat to his head, the other waving frantically at Elias, who stood in the cotton field checking the bowls for readiness. Hannah had been preparing supper, peeling potatoes at the kitchen table while Mary helped and the boys played outside, but she dropped the knife and moved to the window. Something in Jacob's posture, in the wild movement of his arms, made her stomach clench with the same sick feeling she'd had 3 days earlier when the stranger had ridden through asking questions. Elias met Jacob at the edge of the field, and Hannah watched as the old man bent over, hands on his knees, gasping for breath and talking at the same time. Even from 100 yards away, she could see Elias's body stiffen, could see him turn to look toward the road that led to town. Then he was running too, running toward the house, and Hannah's hands began to shake. She'd lived 34 years, 29 of them in a world where white anger could descend without warning, without reason, without mercy. She recognized the shape of danger even before she knew its specific form. By the time Elias burst through the door, she'd already begun calculating what they could carry, how fast the children could run, where they might hide. "They're coming," Elias said, and his voice had a quality she'd never heard before, something raw and stripped down to pure fear. "Tom Jeffries just told Jacob. There's a mob forming in town. Maybe 50 men, maybe more. They're saying we've been harboring criminals, saying we've been stealing livestock, saying we've been looking at white women wrong." He was moving as he talked, pulling their old carpet bag from under the bed, stuffing it with whatever his hands found. "They're drunk and they're armed, and Tom says they're planning to come tonight. We need to leave. Right now. All of us." Hannah felt something cold settle into her chest, something that felt like acceptance and terror mixed together. "How long do we have?" "Hour, maybe 2 if we're lucky." Elias grabbed his rifle from above the door, then seemed to think better of it and put it back. "No, we run. We don't fight. We can't fight 50 men. He looked at Hannah and his eyes were wet. "Get the children. Get whatever you can carry. We leave in 10 minutes. The next 10 minutes moved with the strange elasticity of panic, where seconds stretched like hours and hours compressed into heartbeats. Hannah gathered the children, Thomas and Mary and little James, and she kept her voice calm, even though her hands wouldn't stop shaking. "We're going on a trip," she told them. "Right now. It'll be an adventure. Pack your favorite things, but only what you can carry." Thomas, 14 and old enough to read the terror in his parents' faces, nodded silently and helped his siblings without asking questions. Mary cried. James thought it was exciting. Elias ran to warn the other families, moving from house to house in the failing light, pounding on doors and shouting warnings. Hannah watched from the window as lights began appearing in windows across Glenwood, as people emerged from their homes looking confused and frightened. She saw Sarah Johnson, the school teacher, standing in her doorway with her hand over her mouth. She saw the Washington family loading their wagon, the baby crying. She saw old Samuel Brooks, too sick to travel, being carried out of his house by his sons. By 7 o'clock, chaos had transformed Glenwood into something unrecognizable. People were running between houses, shouting questions, trying to decide whether to flee or stay and defend their homes. Some families began packing wagons. Others gathered weapons. Elias stood in the center of the clearing and tried to organize an evacuation, but panic doesn't organize easily. "Everyone needs to leave," he was shouting. "Take your families and go. Head toward Atlanta or into the swamps. Split up. Don't stay grouped together. They can't chase all of us." But then Thomas Jefferson Cooper, who'd been standing guard on the road, came running back with his face pale. "They're here," he gasped. "I saw torches. Half a mile out, maybe less. Moving fast." The words hit like a physical blow. Half a mile. 5 minutes. Maybe 10. Not enough time to run. Not nearly enough time. Hannah felt her legs go weak. Around her, she heard screams, heard children crying, heard men cursing and women praying. The evacuation plan collapsed into pure terror. Some people ran for the woods. Others froze. The Wright family tried to load their wagon, but the mule bolted and the wagon overturned, spilling their possessions into the dirt. Elias made a decision. "Everyone who can't run, get inside the church. Women and children in the church. Men, if you have weapons, spread out. Maybe we can hold them off long enough for families to escape." It wasn't a good plan. It wasn't even a real plan. But it was something, and in that moment, something felt better than nothing. Hannah grabbed her children and ran for the church along with maybe 20 other women and children. Behind her, she heard Elias shouting instructions to the men, heard the metallic click of rifle hammers being cocked. The church door was heavy wood, and once they were inside, several men barricaded it with pews. The interior was dark except for 2 oil lamps, and the shadows jumped and twisted on the walls. Someone was praying out loud, a desperate stream of words that ran together into a single pleading cry. Hannah pulled her children close and tried to make herself small in the corner, tried to make her children invisible. Through the church's single window she could see the men of Glenwood taking positions. Elias stood with his back to her, rifle in hand, facing the road. Beside him were Jacob Miller, the Washington brothers, young Thomas Cooper, 15 other men armed with whatever they could find. They looked pitifully small, pitifully unprepared. Some of them were shaking. Most of them had never fired a weapon at another human being. They were farmers and fathers, not soldiers, and they were about to die defending houses they'd built with their own hands. The torches appeared first. Hannah saw them crest the rise at the edge of Glenwood's boundary like a row of malevolent stars, dozens of them moving in a loose line that stretched across the road. Then came the sounds. Voices raised in a roar that wasn't quite language, wasn't quite human. It was the sound of men who'd given themselves permission to become monsters, who'd drunk enough whiskey and hatred to believe that what they were about to do was righteous. As they got closer, individual voices separated from the mass. "Burn them out!" someone screamed. "Teach these uppity niggers a lesson. String them up!" The mob stopped about 50 yards from where the Glenwood men stood, and for a moment there was an almost surreal pause. Hannah could see their faces now in the torchlight. White faces twisted with rage and excitement and something that looked almost like joy. They were merchants and farmers, town councilmen and saloon keepers. She recognized Tucker Morgan, who ran the general store where she bought flour, recognized James Whitfield, whose wife she'd helped when the woman was sick last winter. These weren't strangers. These were neighbors, and they'd come to kill. One man stepped forward, a massive figure in a leather vest carrying a torch in one hand and a shotgun in the other. "You got 2 choices," he bellowed. "You can leave now, walk away from this land that don't belong to you, or you can stay and die on it. You got 1 minute to decide." Elias stood absolutely still, and Hannah saw him raise his rifle slightly, saw him sighting down the barrel at the big man. "Don't," she thought. "Please don't. If he fires first, we all die." "This is our land," Elias shouted back, and his voice only trembled a little. "We bought it legal. We got deeds. We got rights." The big man laughed, and the mob laughed with him. "Rights? You think a nigger got rights?" He spat on the ground. "Your minute's up." What happened next happened so fast that Hannah's mind couldn't process it in real time, could only piece it together later from fragments of memory that didn't quite fit together. Someone in the mob fired a shot. The sound was enormous, and in its wake there was a second of perfect silence before everything exploded into chaos. The Glenwood men fired back. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness like lightning. The mob surged forward with a collective roar, and Hannah saw Elias firing and reloading, saw Jacob Miller go down clutching his chest, saw the Washington brothers trying to drag him back to cover. The mob had more men and more guns and no fear of dying. Within 30 seconds, they'd overwhelmed the defensive line. Hannah watched through the window, her hand clamped over Mary's eyes, as Elias clubbed one man with his rifle butt and then disappeared under a wave of attackers. She screamed his name, but the sound was lost in the cacophony of gunfire and shouting. Beside her, other women were screaming too, a chorus of anguish that rose above even the sounds of violence outside. Then the mob reached the church. They didn't bother with the door. They went straight for the walls, throwing torches onto the wooden roof, and within seconds flames were spreading across the dry shingles. Smoke began pouring in through the gaps in the walls. Women were pounding on the barricaded door, screaming to be let out, but the men who'd barricaded it were gone, dead or scattered. Hannah grabbed Thomas's arm. "The back window," she gasped through the smoke. "We go out the back window." It was small, barely large enough for an adult to squeeze through, but it was their only chance. She boosted James through first, then Mary, then pushed Thomas after them. "Run!" she screamed at them. Run for the swamp and don't look back." She watched her children disappear into the darkness, watched Thomas pulling his siblings, watched them vanish into the trees. Then she turned to help other women who were trying to climb through, lifting children, pushing them toward the window, toward safety, toward anything that wasn't this burning church. She was helping Mrs. Washington lift her baby through the window when part of the roof collapsed. Burning timber crashed down, and the interior filled with smoke so thick she couldn't see 2 feet in front of her face. She heard screaming, heard flames crackling, heard the sound of more gunfire outside. Her lungs burned. Her eyes watered. She dropped to her knees where the air was slightly clearer and crawled toward where she thought the window was. Her hand touched something hot and she jerked back. Someone stumbled over her in the darkness. She kept crawling. She made it to the window somehow, pulled herself through, fell into the dirt outside. For a moment she just lay there coughing, her lungs spasming, her vision blurred. When she could finally see again, she wished she couldn't. Glenwood was burning. Every house, every building, engulfed in flames that turned the night orange. Bodies lay in the clearing, dark shapes that didn't move. The mob was everywhere, dragging people from their homes, shooting men who tried to resist, loading wagons with anything valuable. Hannah pulled herself to her feet and ran. She didn't know where her children had gone, but she ran in the direction she'd sent them, toward the tree line, toward the swamp. Behind her, someone shouted, "There's another one!" And she heard boots pounding the earth. A gunshot rang out and something tugged at her sleeve. She didn't stop. Couldn't stop. She crashed into the trees, branches whipping her face, roots catching her feet, and she kept running until her legs gave out, and she collapsed into brackish water that came up to her knees. She crouched there in the water, hidden by darkness and hanging moss, her chest heaving, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might burst. From a 1/4 mile away, she could still see the flames, could still hear screaming and gunshots and the triumphant howls of men who'd become animals. She stayed there for hours, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly, while Glenwood burned and people died and everything she'd known for 20 years turned to ash. When dawn came, the screaming had stopped. Hannah pulled herself out of the swamp and moved like a ghost through the remains of her world. The fires had burned down to smoldering ruins. Bodies lay where they'd fallen. She found Elias hanging from the oak tree beside their house, his feet barely touching the ground, his face unrecognizable. She found Jacob Miller shot in the back trying to run. She found Mrs. Washington and her baby, both dead, huddled together behind an overturned wagon. She found 14 bodies in total, though she knew there were more she couldn't find, consumed by fire or dragged away by the mob. She didn't find her children. She searched every house, every hiding place, every body, but Thomas and Mary and James were gone. Either dead somewhere in the swamp where she couldn't reach them, or fled so far she'd never find them, or taken by the mob for reasons she couldn't bear to imagine. She called their names until her voice was gone, wandered through the ruins until her legs refused to carry her, and finally collapsed beside the burned skeleton of the church, screaming silently at a sky that offered no answers. The sun rose on September 29th, 1906, and Glenwood was gone. 19 people dead, houses destroyed, fields trampled, 23 years of work and hope and pride erased in a single night of hate. Hannah Carter sat in the ashes of her life and felt something inside her break in a way that would never heal. And somewhere in Atlanta, a newspaper was already preparing an article that would describe the events as a minor disturbance, quickly resolved, with no casualties reported. Jennifer Mason's article appeared in the Journal of Southern History in August 2019, 13 years after she first opened that cardboard box. The delay hadn't been intentional. She'd submitted her preliminary findings in late 2019, expecting a 6-month review process. Instead, she'd faced 3 years of resistance from peer reviewers who questioned her methodology, demanded additional sources that didn't exist, and suggested repeatedly that she might be overstating the significance of her discoveries. One reviewer had written, with barely concealed hostility, "The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but neither is it sufficient grounds for the inflammatory conclusions Dr. Mason proposes." But Jennifer had continued working. She'd found property records showing that 43 parcels of land in what had been Glenwood were seized by the county in October 1906 for unpaid taxes and resold to white buyers within 2 months. She'd located train manifests showing 4 African Americans purchasing one-way tickets from Atlanta to Chicago on October 2, 1906, their names matching 4 of the survivors from the photograph. She'd discovered a handwritten notation in a Fulton County Sheriff's ledger for September 29, 1906. Responded to fire at Negro settlement. No action taken. Property abandoned. Most damning of all, she'd found the original glass plate negative of the photograph in the Wilson family archives, and on its storage envelope, written in John Wilson's hand. Glenwood, August 1906. They were murdered 6 weeks later. I should have warned them. The article published with the photograph on its opening page, 23 faces staring out across 113 years. Within 48 hours, Jennifer's email inbox had exploded. 300 messages the first day, 700 by the end of the week. Some were from historians praising her work. Others were from white supremacists threatening her life. But the ones that mattered were from descendants. 12 separate families reached out, each claiming connection to someone in the photograph. They sent family Bibles with birth records, letters written by grandparents who'd fled Georgia, photographs of people who looked eerily similar to the faces in Jennifer's image. The most important email came from Diane Carter Washington, a 73-year-old woman living in Detroit. Her message was brief. My grandmother was Hannah Carter from Glenwood. She survived. I have her testimony. We need to talk. Jennifer called her within the hour. Diane's voice was steady, matter of fact, as she explained that her grandmother had lived until 1982, dying at 96. She never talked about it, Diane said. Not for 60 years. Then in 1972, when I was 26, she sat me down one afternoon and told me everything, made me write it down, said someone needed to know, even if the world never believed it. Jennifer drove to Detroit 3 days later. Diane lived in a small house in a neighborhood that felt worn but loved, where neighbors sat on porches and children played in yards surrounded by chain-link fences. Inside, Diane's living room was a shrine to family history. Photographs covered every surface, a visual timeline stretching back 5 generations. She led Jennifer to a locked cabinet and removed a leather journal, its pages yellowed and brittle. My grandmother dictated this to me over 3 days, Diane said. I wrote down every word exactly as she said it. She made me promise to keep it safe until someone asked the right questions. Hannah Carter's testimony, transcribed in Diane's careful handwriting, was 18 pages long. It described the photograph, the warning from Jacob Miller, the failed evacuation, the mob's arrival. It listed names, the 14 people she'd found dead the morning after, and the 9 others whose bodies she'd never found. It described carrying Elias's body down from the oak tree, alone, because there was no one left to help her. It explained how she'd walked 43 miles to Atlanta over 3 days, sleeping in ditches, drinking from streams, arriving at her sister Josephine's house more dead than alive. But the most devastating sections were about her children. Hannah had searched for Thomas, Mary, and James for 17 years. She'd traveled back to Glenwood's ruins twice, hiring private investigators with money she'd saved from cleaning houses. She'd written letters to orphanages, hospitals, police stations across Georgia, Alabama, Florida. In 1915, she received a response from a colored orphanage in Mobile that had admitted 3 children matching her descriptions in October 1906. The children had given false names, spoken little, and been separated after 6 months when they proved difficult to manage. The orphanage had no records of where they'd gone after that. Hannah never found them. She'd died not knowing if her children had survived or what had happened to them after that September night. Jennifer sat at Diane's kitchen table reading the testimony 3 times, her hands shaking, tears streaming down her face that she didn't bother to wipe away. This is what I've been looking for, she said finally. This is the proof. Diane nodded. My grandmother made me promise one more thing. She said when I found someone who believed her, someone who would tell the story right, I should give them this. She reached back into the cabinet and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside was a piece of fabric, white with blue flowers, aged to brown and yellow. "This is from the dress my grandmother wore the day they took the photograph," Diane said. "She kept it her whole life. She wanted it to go with the story, so people would know she was real, that all of them were real." Jennifer published a follow-up article 6 months later, "The Glenwood Massacre: New Evidence from Survivor Testimony." This time, the response from the academic community was different. The American Historical Association invited her to present at their annual conference. The New York Times ran a feature story. NPR produced a podcast episode. Suddenly, Glenwood wasn't forgotten. It was impossible to ignore. Historians began searching their own archives for similar erasures, finding dozens of prosperous black communities destroyed in the early 20th century, their histories deliberately obscured. Tulsa, Rosewood, Wilmington, Ocoee, and now Glenwood. In October 2022, the state of Georgia unveiled a historical marker at the site where Glenwood had stood. It was a small thing, a metal plaque on a post beside a county road that now ran through what had once been cotton fields. The land was owned by a logistics company, its warehouses covering the ground where 43 families had built their lives. But the marker was there, permanent, listing 19 confirmed deaths and acknowledging that the actual number was likely higher. The dedication ceremony was attended by 147 people, most of them descendants. Diane Carter Washington stood at the front, her hand on the marker, her grandmother's testimony folded in her pocket. Jennifer didn't speak at the ceremony. She stood at the back of the crowd, watching as elderly black men and women placed flowers at the marker's base, as children listened to their grandparents explain what had happened here. She thought about the photograph, about 23 people who'd stood together in August heat, believing they'd earned the right to exist. She thought about Elias Carter, who'd built a house and raised children and defended his land with a rifle he'd known wouldn't be enough. She thought about Hannah, walking 43 miles through Georgia countryside, carrying trauma that would never heal, searching for children she'd never find. Most of all, she thought about erasure, about how easy it is to kill people and then kill their memory, about how a mob could murder 19 people, burn 43 houses, destroy 23 years of work, and have it recorded in official documents as a minor disturbance, no casualties reported. About how efficient America had been at erasing black prosperity, at making success look like it had never happened. About how close Glenwood had come to remaining forgotten forever, just another blank space where a community should have been. But the photograph had survived. John Wilson had hidden the negative, unable to destroy it, unable to show it, preserving evidence for someone who might someday ask the right questions. And that was the thing about photographs. They didn't argue or explain or justify. They simply existed, insisting that the people in them had existed too. 23 faces staring into Wilson's camera, proud and doomed and utterly real. You could burn houses and kill people and rewrite newspapers, but you couldn't erase a photograph unless you destroyed it. And this one had survived. Jennifer drove back to Atlanta as the sun set, the marker disappearing in her rearview mirror. She thought about all the other boxes sitting in archives, waiting to be opened. About all the other forgotten communities, their stories reduced to vague notations in ledgers, their descendants left to wonder if their grandparents' memories were true or merely trauma-induced fantasy. She thought about how much history was still hidden, how many massacres still unrecorded, how many names still erased. The photograph sat on her desk when she returned to her office the next morning. She'd made copies, sent the original to a climate-controlled archive where it would be preserved indefinitely. But she kept one print on her desk, in a simple black frame. 23 people, 19 dead within 6 weeks, 4 scattered across America, carrying trauma that would echo through generations. And now, finally, 116 years later, they had names. They had a story. They had a marker beside a county road saying they'd existed, they'd mattered, they'd been murdered. It wasn't justice. Nothing could be justice for what had happened to Glenwood. But it was memory. And memory, Jennifer had learned, was its own kind of resistance. You couldn't kill people twice. Once they were remembered, once their names were spoken and their stories told, they became unkillable. Elias Carter would never build another house. Hannah Carter would never find her children. But their photograph would outlast the mob that killed them, would outlast the system that tried to erase them, would outlast every lie told about what happened on September 28, 1906. Jennifer looked at the photograph and thought about something Diane had told her during that first visit to Detroit. My grandmother said the worst part wasn't losing everything. It was people not believing she'd ever had anything to lose. People acting like Glenwood was just a story she'd made up, like black people owning land and building schools and being proud was too impossible to be real. Diane had paused then, her eyes wet. She said the photograph was the only proof she'd ever been happy. The photograph remained. 23 people, frozen at the apex of their lives, 6 weeks before extinction. Proof that they'd been happy. Proof that they'd existed. Proof that America had systematically destroyed black prosperity and then pretended it never existed in the first place. And now, proof that erasure could be fought, that history could be recovered, that the dead could speak if someone listened hard enough. Glenwood was no longer forgotten. And that, Jennifer thought, looking at the faces staring back at her across 13 decades, was exactly what Elias Carter had wanted when he'd paid John Wilson $12 to document his community's pride. He'd wanted proof. He'd wanted memory. He'd wanted to be impossible to erase. And finally, 116 years late, he'd gotten his wish.